And so now we're just taking the rectangle, 10 times 50 times 1/2 of 10 times 10 gives you the expected benefit of 550. Questions on that? So that was part B, and then part C was during bad times, what is the cost of being in the cluster as opposed to being isolated? And now we're working backwards. Again, along a different demand curve, you've got two points that you're working with. And so the expected cost associated with that is the rectangle times that triangle is 450. And then the last one was just explanation of why the cluster's better. All right, does that make sense once you put it in those terms, or think about the question in those terms? I love the natural light, but I haven't quite figured out the proper to have. Okay. All right, other questions on this homework? It looked like you all got the table, the 3-5. That's fine. What was the conclusion from that model, the dial?
Can you move it back up?
Yep.
Sorry, just to where I can see the. There, that's right. Thank you.
Do you mind if I shift?
No, go ahead.
Cool.
I think everybody's. No, we got. Oh yeah.
Is it ready?
I think it'll open it freshly placed. I think she's just gonna vacuum. So with the dial model, questions on that? What was the conclusion? To me, that model was kind of fun from a geek standpoint, to figure out what they were doing with it. And it had a conclusion. That I want you to know from it. It probably doesn't give us a lot more than that, but it's kind of neat the way they set it up. What was the conclusion from that?
More workers, the higher the wage.
Yes, so the more workers, we've got the higher wage, and why is that? That's right.
Because you can spread out your training costs over more people, skills gaps on our side.
The skills gap, yeah. The skills gap gets reduced the more people we add. And so that's kind of just the big conclusion to take away from that after you learn the little dial and what an eighth of a person away is. And, we got this gap question. I thought the training cost thing, when I went through the model the first time, I was a little bit lost on, I usually think of training costs being a one and done, like you train somebody and then they're done, whereas here it's set up as an ongoing cost. And we can think about that cost in a couple different ways. It just could be that this person's just not a good fit for the position. And when you guys get into the business world more down the road, you'll find that there's people that aren't quite a good fit for your organization, and that means there's costs going on. Sometimes not always monetary, but just headache costs. Like that person's a pain in the butt type of cost. Like I don't want to come to work today and sit in with a meeting with that person. That's the type of cost that we might be talking about in terms of the skills gap. And so the more people we have in a larger metropolitan area, the better chance we have of getting the right person, the right fit. And so that's our takeaway from that model. Any other comments or questions on that one? All right, any of the other homework problems? Number 10. Okay, I'm going to get the question out here.
I saw him talk about it in chapter 4.
Yeah, and this was for chapter 3, right? All right, according to conventional wisdom concerning urban economic development, a city should develop a diverse economy with a large number of industries. Evaluate the merits of this advice in light of the empirical evidence concerning the magnitudes of localization and urbanization. So, did they do a little bit of empirics? They did a little bit towards the end, didn't they? They had the elasticities. So I think it was kind of referencing that. So there is evidence that localization economies are stronger than urbanization economies, so it's not obvious that diversification is a better strategy. So what's the difference between localization and urbanization?
Localization, like one of them is the one where firms within an industry cluster together, and then the other one is where firms across industries.
Right, so which one gives more diversity? Urbanization or urbanization, yeah. So that's what they're kind of saying is that what we're putting together in these models is that there's these competing forces, and depending on the industry, it might be better for a whole bunch of similar type firms, which would be more homogeneous, to get together. That's the localization part. Or the circumstances might have it that there's more urbanization, which is more of the diversity coming across. Okay, anything else there?
Where did we end up with 4/3 on 6?
4/3 on 6.
The mismatch of 4/3 skin tones. That was the one part of that.
What part was it?
It was on C. We might work that out.
Part C.
I reworked these problems to get numbers, so I actually dropped that C.
Do the average.
Yeah, and so there was $2 it was $2 to go one way, $2 to go the other way.
Yeah, and there's one that was 2 away, another that was 2 away, and then one that was 0.
Because it was right on it. That's what firm exactly was. So they had.
So that gave you the 4/3.
And then you divided it up into 3. So.
Okay. All right. Oh shoot! I didn't grab my. I think I forgot to bring something. That's all right. We'll see if we get that far anyway. All right. So chapters 4 and 5. Again, I think I mentioned this are going to be a little softer in nature. We'll have some models that we work through. But it's kind of starting to just continuing to build on the pieces that we've established. And we're going to enter into, we're going to bring utility into the picture in chapter 4. And then add on to that on how that's a dynamic thing. And that's going to kind of bring to a wrap our first section of the book. So yes, this is 4. Whoops. Okay, why do cities vary in size and scope? So what causes some of the variation? So here's some real world data from 2000. Populations greater than 10 million. Just 2. 5 to 10, and then we start to see it go up and up. And so the authors of these papers that the textbook author is citing kind of looked at that problem and said, why? Right? Why do we have this structure? Why isn't it that we have, if there's 300 million people in the United States, why don't we have 30 10 million person cities? You know, what drives that result is part of what we're looking at, so that we have a lot of cities less than 100,000, and then it goes up from there. What are some of the underlying reasons? So, as a first step to thinking about this problem, this model puts together different elements. And we've got utility over here, and it's $59, $70, $66. that what we learned in intermediate micro and even principles class for that matter? Do we always measure utility in dollars? What is utility measured in? Utils, yeah, we have our fancy util word, which I've always hated. And what gives you a util? Yeah, the util really is happiness. So what drives you getting 2 utils versus 4 utils?
Personal.
Here I go down the slippery slope of using the word util, which I already hate already. I'm regretting as I'm saying it. What is it that gives you that happiness?
Your personal preferences.
That drives the shape of your preferences. Like what?
Beer.
Beer, good. What else?
Other consumption goods.
Other consumption goods, so generic consumption goods. Time with the family. I mean, we can get as rich as we want to, but I want you to make sure you physically have in your mind that utility does not come from dollars. Dollars can be inflated away by the Federal Reserve, so I don't want you to be thinking that. So this is a simplification that economists do often, is that we can look at what's called indirect utility, which I don't think we covered that in intermediate class, but as you derive the demand functions for goods, so you guys remember the inverse demand functions and the demand functions, and that is dependent upon the price structure. So if I'm looking at the price of beer, my demand for beer is dependent upon the price of beer, but it's also dependent upon the price of wine and the price of pretzels and the price of pizza, right? So prices kind of drive my structure to choosing the optimal level of pizza, beer, wine, pretzels, all those things. Those quantities that I chose are what gives me satisfaction or gives me utility. Since the demand functions are functions of prices and income, then it's possible to show utility this way, kind of indirectly through prices and income. And this is even a kind of a simplification beyond that. I get $59 worth of income, it gives me 59 units of satisfaction. So we kind of just, as a simplification, say that more money makes me happier, less money makes me less happy. All right, so that's just a simplifying thing, but it's kind of weird, and I don't think the textbook, well, they make a little comment on it, but wanted you to think about that. And here we've got different sizes. And so what's the story going on here?
Even though you pay more in a city for 4 million people versus a city of 2 million people because of your commuting costs and other things associated with costs of living around that many people,
Okay.
you end up with less take-home pay and therefore less utility really, and decreases.
Okay. So commuting cost is a good or a bad? A bad, right? So as that going up, we have that cost going on. Labor income and wages going up. What seems to be going on here? Look closely at those numbers.
They're working 8 hours.
We're working an 8-hour day, right? And if one goes up, so as wages goes up, the income's going up, but my hours that I'm working presumably is staying the same here if my wage is going up. So we got an average wage of 8. I put in an 8-hour shift, I got $64, $80, $88. So my income's going up, but then I've got this commuting cost. As the city becomes more and more congested, I'm in traffic for 45 minutes instead of 15 minutes, and that adds cost, maybe in a variety of ways. All right, so then we get these competing forces on this utility function. We mentioned all those. And if we graph that out, it's going to look something like that. This upside down U. Notice our horizontal axis is workers in the city. So as congestion goes up, my commuting cost starts to outweigh my wage effect. The agglomeration from the wages going up starts to outweigh from the congestion. We've got those two things competing to give us this shape. All right, questions or comments on that one? So where do you want to be? At the M, right? So ideally you'd want to be at an M. So there might be forces at play that would want to pull you one direction or the other in order to maximize utility. We're going to add a little more detail. So what's this locational equilibrium concept we keep coming back to in the chapters? That's one of our principles.
That people will be, everybody's the first act.
It is, yep.
Prices equilibrate in the city versus other markets.
Okay, so yeah, it's the prices that are going to ultimately equalize between the two locations. And so we can start to look at the different forces that might be at play and what would be changing. So with this example, what's going on with land rent paid?
The closer you are to our city.
Okay, so land prices are going up the closer you are to the city. And then this is a little strange here. So we got utility being driven by labor income and rental income, and then subtracting out your commuting cost and your rent paid. Does anybody remember that from the chapter, since I did officially assign the reading? Who's got that one nailed down? This might be worth an extra credit point.
The rental income?
Yeah, what is that? That's a little bit of an oddball here.
It was like assuming that everybody, like, was also like renting out land so that they were receiving rental income, like.
Okay.
People.
And how did they, why is this all 15? I think you've earned your point already, and I'm not going to give you another one, but.
Just because there's an
And it's
average.
the average.
Yeah, so what would they be saying? What would that, why would that make any sense whatsoever? Again, it's an economic model, so we can make some goofy assumptions if we want, but why would we just average that out?
They want to stay competitive.
No. That's a good thought, though, since they're all equal. No, it doesn't even come down to that. That's why I wanted to point this out and not hold a point hostage
There's no
for
point to averaging it, they just do it.
it. You're close. You're probably real close. They kind of treat it like it's a corporation and that everybody jointly owns the real estate. And so we're going to share the rental income. I own land that's close to the city. I own land that's away from the city. I own all of it. And then we're going to spread it evenly among the people. So it's a bit of a stretch. It's a bit of a stretch. But that's where they take it. So we got equal shares, kind of like a corporation with the land rent.
Did any of us get extra credit points?
Yeah, Chelsea did. So a system, so a system of cities. We've got different possibilities, and so we're kind of begging the question of why would a city develop in different ways? So let's say we've got a certain amount of workers, 6 cities with 1 million, 3 with 2, 2 with 3. So 3 different cases to think about. So this is our utility hump. Along the negatively sloped portion, changes in population are self-correcting. Changes in population are self-correcting. correcting? I think that's what's going on there.
If people aren't happy in whatever city they're going to move.
Okay. What's the correcting part? So let's think about migration.
Well, like with this, when they're on the negatively sloped portion, when people start to move towards the growing city, like it shows they'll experience less utility, and so in the shrinking city, they're experiencing more, so people are going to want to move back to the city that's shrinking.
Yes, there you go.
Is it
Right?
almost the idea of like the error in information being exchanged and all?
I don't know.
That time error. So like
I don't explain what you're saying. I don't know.
Well,
I'm not quite
isn't-
tracking with you.
Wasn't there one class where we talked about how like markets will adjust so quickly but not have the information readily available, and so they'll overcompensate sometimes and then like move back and
Sounds
forth?
interesting, but I don't remember it honestly. Was that from entrepreneurial? You're thinking of something, or?
I thought it was even in like micro or macro or something like that.
I mean, I think you're kind of on the right track.
It's like market overcorrecting itself. And then
I don't think in this case it's an error.
Yeah.
I don't think this is the thought that's going on here isn't really in the error term.
Well, it's just I guess the market is working in real time where the information being like, I guess.
I think it was part of the rational expectations model.
Yeah.
Oh.
Where like information's coming in after the fact.
Okay.
It was.
Which
I
might
guess,
leave you okay. So
price
let me just run with you for a sec. So that
Price
maybe
tags.
maybe an error term puts a city here versus here, and one's shrinking, one's growing. So after the correction, or what's the correction mechanism? What happens after that? After errors are realized, let's say, kind of just rolling with what you're saying.
And they move.
And Chelsea, what were you saying? I think you kind of hit it there. What's the self-correction part of this? After the errors, if we run with Michael's, that maybe there was some errors and so we're different. What's the self-correction?
People move back to the shrinking city.
Okay, so the shrinking city, why are they moving back to the shrinking city?
They're increasing utility.
Because the utility's higher, right? So they're attracted to that. So then the growing city, maybe through this error thing you're talking about, there's a divergence, but then these people realize, oh, this place sucks. And this place, whoa, that looks like a good place. And so they start heading this direction. As they head that direction, the shrinking city stops shrinking and starts growing. And so we find equilibrium in the middle. And so what's interesting about this is that this ends up being kind of a sticky situation, a sticky point, because we're always correcting to be on the negatively sloped portion of the utility curve. So once we get to that point, what's somewhat unmodeled here is how we get to that point in the first place. But once we're at this point, the size of the city, then there'd be some, there's an argument to be made that we'd stay on that slope. Okay. How about on the positive side? Self-reinforcing.
So they'll never move to the shrinking city on the smaller side. So that's why it's never too small, because it always passes in. And then
Right. So we're always going to be heading this direction, right? Because there's utility increases for everybody in the growing city. So then it's like attracting. So here, the movement or the growth of the city is self-reinforcing. The city's going to continue to grow because we're moving up along here. And as soon as we reach M, then maybe through your error mechanism, we go too far, and then it starts to become stabilized. Somewhere on the negatively sloped portion of the utility curve, it would be stabilized. But we have to find where that maximum point is at some point.
And like the more people that move to in, the further the gap between S and M. So that gives the people from S like
Even more incentive, yeah. Yeah, to move to the city. The city is where the land of milk and honey flows, right? And so they're all attracted, but then the milk and honey,
But that's in the farmland.
each marginal person, there's less and less milk milk and honey, so it goes down. All right, so that's the concept here of the utility curve. All right, so cities might be too large but not too small. So too large, why do we say that they might be too large? Cities might be too large but not too small.
The shrinking utility.
Because why?
Because as they grow, utility begins to shrink.
Okay. And why would we say not too large? I get the too small. Cities can't be too small because it's a self-reinforcing effect and they're going to grow. But cities can be too large. Like they're just too doggone big. So cities can be too large. Why? What's their argument here using the model?
The utility per person is going to go down, so they're trying to shrink back, but they can never truly.
But you can't do it, right? Because of the self-correction that's going on. So again, it's a sticky spot. So ideally, the city would be this size if we had, you know, the central planner figuring out how to change things, utilities higher, but no individual agent can take action to get it there. So we end up being at a point like L. So that's the only point there is it's just that balance of the self-correcting mechanism versus the self-reinforcing. Any other questions or comments on that graph? All right, so now we're going to think about the localization and urbanization aspects of it. Let's give this a read.
Is that supposed to be groups?
Feels their way through, maybe.
I'm
As
just,
far as I know, it's supposed to be gross.
I'm just double checking. It's an odd word for an econ class, I guess.
Oh, come on, you were in Freakonomics. We talk about odd words once in a while. We get have fun.
Because abortion caused.
Okay, so we're trying to think about an evolution that might be going on as we start to grow. And so there's been some examples. We're just going to kind of run through a few slides here to kind of justify how industries might evolve over time as we grope our way through what works and what doesn't work, right? So, what do you guys know about Radio City and New York and what they're describing here from your history? Or what does radio look like today versus then?
It's consolidated in a sense.
Okay, and how? I'd agree with you.
Where it says like firms were small, numerous, agile, nervous, and heavily reliant on subcontractors. They've become consolidated into larger corporations where each station is owned by a larger entity.
Okay.
And thus, you have the large corporations that have the smaller.
So we got the one pop playlist that if
Yeah.
you go to Kansas City or if you go to Minneapolis or you go to whatever, you can tune to that one station and they play the same darn songs on some sort of track, right?
Well, I mean, like even in Kansas City, the alternative station is housed in the same corporation as the country station, as well as
Might be in
Fox
one
Sports
building.
or something
Yeah,
like that.
yeah,
And they're
and
all
so-
the same broadcaster.
And what got us that result?
Lower costs.
Okay, and what would be a fancier term to put on it? Economies of scale, right? So there was some sort of economies. Were those economies known about early on? Probably not, right? We just kind of trying to feel out in the early days of New York City being small, numerous, agile. they had to get live guest stars probably. There wasn't maybe a lot of recorded music. They have to figure out what the consumer likes. So there can be a lot of diversity for growing reasons rather than just that's the way the industry is and it automatically gets there. All right, so some other things over in France. Laboratory city, checking things out, trying new things. Very much talked about that. I'll let you guys give a quick read. Okay, so now we're going to put these concepts together and think about the size of the cities as we go. So that argument there was we might have New York City with a bunch of radios, but we might have Georgia with a bunch of rugs or something. And there might be, more specifically, that was probably a bad example, because I had them too geographically apart. There might be small cities near Manhattan where you've got the big center city and then you've got other cities nearby that evolve. And these localization economies kind of explain how those cities might be different. And so there might be localization economies in one but not in the other. And so one would tend to grow large in size. And so near one particular geographic area, we would expect to see cities of different sizes near each other. So again, the argument here is to say, well, why don't we have just one big old city? Why do we have cities with distinct character and culture of different sizes? And using the model we did, cities reach a certain size where localization economies and urbanization economies and the mix of those two things going on make them sticky. And whereas other cities, if there's strong localization economies up to a certain point, might start attracting those people to climb up to a city until it gets that size. And so we've got this diversity across a geographic area where there might be some small cities and some big cities. And the explanation is through localization and urbanization. Okay, questions or comments on that? I guess we talked about this before, but who wants to comment on that?
Is that the stable utility outcome of shrinking versus the growing city?
Yes. And so a little bit more. What's it?
Cooperating utility in this case, kind of like.
And so tell me give me the economic story of that. What is it? Give me an interpretation.
It's giving nobody any incentive to move from the small city to the large city.
All right.
Vice versa. It's gotten to a point where everyone's basically at the same utility living regardless of where city they're in.
Okay, good. So probably two alternatives to look at. One would be the geeky economist that would say, well, people are all identical human beings, and therefore utility will equilibrate across three spaces of time. Or maybe the more reasonable interpretation, that might be equally geeky, would be that a person is indifferent between living in the small city, the medium city, or the big city, right? So we can think of one person. There's various factors that will leave that person indifferent between the two. The commuting cost, the labor, all of those things that we talked about before.
Is that when each of those three cities is at their equilibriums, like equilibrium size?
Yeah, all the migration has happened. Yep. So the shrinking and the growing, all of that's occurred.
So this is all long term.
Mm-hmm. Yep, long-term prediction of what we expect to see in having different sized cities in the same spot. Okay. Why do we got brain surgeons? Why don't we have any brain surgeons in Ottawa? Actually, I'm not so sure we don't, but I know we don't have an opera, except for what the school play puts on once in a while.
Ooh. Ooh.
So this is one of those that we might kind of say, duh, but at the same time we're studying spatial economics, so we got to kind of recognize that.
The population density isn't high enough here
Okay.
Let's go to a bigger city, and all the smaller cities will just come to it.
Okay, yep. So with the number of people that are attracted to the opera, so we can now start to get into differentiated taste for goods potentially, or the number of operas that any given identical human being wants to go to is one a year, right? So we take one identical human being, and the most they want to go to is one a year. Well, that demand, that population then only supports a certain amount of opera, whereas with pizza, you want it 52 times a year, right? So that identical human being wants pizza and a haircut 12 times a year, and pizza 52 times a year. That might be a little heavy, but that's why I picked it out. That's what I was thinking, you know, with college anyway, that's probably more likely the case. But those are, so it's kind of a demand side argument to it. There might be varying degrees of economies of scale, but even if we throw that out the window, the fact that there's a limited amount of demand for that particular item would cause a need to have it be located in a high dense area, or a densely populated area. Okay, any last comments, questions there? Okay, so chapter 5 is going to expand on this even more. What is the export employment? The what? Yes, and what do you think it is?
People going to a different city to work.
Okay, going to a different city to work. So, is it them leaving their city to go to work?
Or isn't it their exports leaving the city?
So how would you phrase that then?
People working in a city and exporting goods to other cities?
The goods that they make within that city are exported out. That's the factor we're looking at. So we've got local employment being the people who are in the city making haircuts. The haircut and pizza people are the local employment. And so what do we got for Ottawa? That would be export employment.
Like a truck factory at the north side of town.
Yeah, that north side steel production stuff is probably a great example of that. Most of that steel is not being consumed by people in Ottawa, right? So it's not a haircut or a pizza. It's being made. They might have 5 people at their factory, or they might have 100 people at the factory, but all of those people are engaged in an activity that's ultimately being sold away. So this starts to bring some of what we talked about in macroeconomics with exports and imports to a micro level. We can start now to think about the city exporting goods out of its locality. And so this is where some of the buy local campaigns, you know, don't shop outside of Ottawa, shop our local businesses on Main Street. Well, there's an argument to be made for that if those owners at the shops are local, which is a question mark, of course, because then we can get back to John's point that somebody in Wellsville might be coming to Ottawa to run their business, and so it's really not local. But if we're keeping those dollars in, are we doing something better? Well, export employment's a good thing to get for a city, because you bring the people in, those people then going through the little commuting exercise, do they choose to live in Ottawa or do they choose to live in Lawrence? I chose to live in Ottawa because I didn't want to do the 20-minute commute, not to mention the housing prices in Lawrence. Took a number of factors, looked at the Russ utility function, and I derived at the optimal solution given a number of errors that maybe Ottawa would be a good place to locate, right? So now that I'm here, I tend to shop more at the local stores. So my being here in an export industry, I'm going a little away from my example, can start to increase local employment. And so that's why we've got this local employment stacked on top of the export employment. And so as we have more and more export employment, it all by itself can start to grow local employment. And that's where Chapter 5 will take us into this relationship between those two. Okay. So again, with this topic being about the size of the cities, you remember the very first thing we started off with was that there was only 2 cities over 10 million, and then we kind of saw cities get bigger. Some of the economists, and this would be even not geologists, geographist. What if you're in geography, studying demographics? So you can be a demographist? I don't know. Anyway, somebody studying that type of stuff started to see a trend here, and this is real world data, having the large city and how other cities rank in comparison to the large one. And they started to see some relationships there between the rank of the city and the size, and started to investigate, is that just an anomaly, or is there something to that? So if we take the biggest city, the largest, and then the second largest, and then the third largest, and rank them that way for 1, 2, 3, 4, that picture that we were just looking at describes a function that approximates this with the rank and the size of the city. So if we take the city of, let's take Kansas City as the biggest city in our metropolitan area, and it has 10 million. What this formula is saying is that the second largest city will have 5 million, the third largest city will have 2.5 million, and that's what starts to give us that picture that we were looking at on the slide before, that it's always half as big. So here's the 10 million, then the 5 for the second largest, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 2.5 million for the 3. And so we start to get a picture that looks like what we were just seeing in the real world data. And it approximates that function. The real world does not follow that function exactly. And so if you let this little parameter b be a scalar that kind of mutates the size of the big city, if that's a 1, so if b equals 1, then this equals itself, right? And then it all collapses down into the ranking divided by the largest city. And so now you can take the real world data and derive the estimates of that parameter. And so the real world says that that b parameter is 1.09. In other words, it's not quite as severe as what that formula says with b equals 1. It's actually a little flatter. And so the real world looks maybe more like that. And again, it's not going to perfectly match it, but we're trying to say, what does the real world look like and why? And that's part of what we're exploring in this chapter. Okay. That number uses political cities. If we look at an economic city, it's a lot closer to 1. What is an economic city?
This one, extra credit point too?
Sure. Why not?
So,
It's like there's a political city.
Oh, wait, is that fair? Let's see. He asked. I'll give Michael first dibs here.
okay. So the political city is like bounded by the government, whereas the economic city is like everybody working within that city's parameters and all that kind of stuff. So it may be people that are outside of the boundaries that are coming in, or people that are within the boundaries that are coming out. But it's like the population of the city as it relates to the economic growth or just entity of the city.
Okay, what do you think, Katie?
So say like the political city and all of the
So by geography, so if we take Kansas City We got, let's see, we got, I don't even know what this really looks like, but we got Casey Mo, we got Casey K, and then we've got Overland Park, and we've got Olathe, and we've got Gardner, and we've got whatever, and Shawnee.
Yeah, so you left out Ottawa.
Is that the geography that you're talking about?
Well, that would be like
It would be more so the people, like everybody that works for Kansas City is an economic.
All right. So I'll give you that one. So we've got something describing the economic. Whoops. I didn't do my fancy layer here. Now you guys are gonna see my secrets now. Oh, I have my randomization. All right, let's see here. Boom, and boom. There we go. So some sort of boundaries determined by the economic activity as we start to go out further. All right, so anyway, that little rule of thumb works better if we look at economic activity. So here's some large cities. Do you notice any trends with some of those large cities? I got my mother-in-law and stepfather-in-law, I'm not sure what to call them, they're in Buenos Aires right now.
Not in the United States.
Okay, that's one trend.
I don't think that's the one that
they're underdeveloped or developing.
Yeah, they're kind of in some countries that are a little bit different. And part of what go ahead, John.
It's like minus Tokyo.
Minus Tokyo, yeah, they're not all the same with this. A lot of these started off with dictatorships, and so political regimes is another topic we're going to look at in the next chapter. All right, I think we'll call it a day there. That wraps up chapter 4. So I will email out the exercises.
And those two have their
Yeah, why don't we keep hitting those. And then we are going to hit the appendix of chapter 4, which won't take very long, but it's kind of a neat little model.